able to hear that.
Yeah, so you'll be able to hear better without Steve and Mike
That's not my problem.
whispering.
Okay, all right. Welcome to the Hillsborough Township Public Meeting of the Planning Board on September 10, 2015. Please join me in the Pledge of Allegiance.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
This meeting has been duly advertised according to Section 5 of the Open Public Meetings Act, Chapter 231, Public Law 1975, the Sunshine Law. Roll call, please.
Yes, Mr. Wagner.
Here.
Mr. Julian.
Here.
Mr. Merdinger.
Here.
Mr. Peason.
Here.
Mr. Lapani.
Here.
Committeeman Delcor.
Here.
Chairman Dr. Cerisi.
Here. First item of business, disposition of the minutes of last week's September 3rd meeting.
Mr. Chairman, the eligible members of the board who may vote are Mr. Merdinger, yourself, Mr. Wagner, Mr. Peason, and Mr. Lapani.
Make a motion.
Second.
Any comments? Roll call, please.
Yes, Mr. Wagner.
Yes.
Mr. Lapani.
Yes.
Mr. Peason.
Yes.
Mr. Merdinger.
Yes.
And Chairman Dr. Cerisi.
Yes.
Thank you.
Next item of business is the resolution for Copart of Connecticut, amended file 14 PB 15 SR. This is a pretty extensive resolution, if you want a few moments to look at it.
Mr. Chairman, this has taken a significant amount of time in reviewing and then negotiating between the parties. Just for the purpose of the record, you, Mr. Julian, Mr. Wagner, Mr. Merdinger, Mr. Delcor, and Mr. Peason are eligible to vote.
And, I obviously can't read it all, it's very long, but I would mention this, that in section 1B, it states that what's being granted here shall not take effect until all of the following occur. Any and all conditions of the resolution are fully and completely accomplished. All mitigation measures required in section 4 of the exhibit, which is the list of mitigations that they have to accomplish, are completely accomplished, installed, and operational. All township and other governmental approvals have been obtained and are fully unconditional, and the board engineer has inspected and approved all such items and has provided his report of full and unconditional compliance, so that the this resolution then empowers a number of improvements to be made and for the township to inspect and approve those improvements. Any motion?
I'll move it.
Any second?
Second.
Mr. Chairman, before you take a vote, there may be somebody who wishes to speak on the issue who's in the audience regarding such stuff.
Yeah, for this one, it's complexity. Any comment from the floor? Okay, come on up. You can use that, yeah, that'd be fine.
Good evening, everyone. Michael Sopko Jr.
Bring it up close.
You can pull it out also, Mike.
Yeah, there you go.
2127 Camp Plain Road, Hillsborough. Thank you for hearing me. The front of Copart's still looks like who did it and ran from one end to the other. There's still garbage strewn everywhere. We're still getting the deliveries at 10:56 at night, not getting out till 11:45. Over the past 3 months, I've called the Hillsborough Police several times for trucks being parked either late at night or early in the morning trying to get in, and it's still the same.
Do you know if there was a police response to your calls?
I called the police 4 times. The third time, it took 3 times to get the police to come out. I don't know if they came out or not. I had left for work at that time.
Okay. It's certainly concerning if you're calling the police and there's no response, and I would definitely ask you to speak to either the administrator or the police chief about that, because you would know the details about
Yes.
when you called them and all of that. As far as the other stuff, I guess at this point, we're not surprised to hear it. What we hope is that the adoption of this resolution will finally give the township some enforcement authority here, that if they want to legalize what they're, what they plan to do, that they're gonna have to comply with things, and that we have in this resolution the mechanism for doing so, and I hope that that helps with the other stuff.
Okay.
But I certainly encourage you to talk to the administrator and/or the police chief about police response.
Okay. Thank you.
And if you do, if you have to reach out to the administrator and/or the police or our zoning office, please make sure if you could advise them to make sure we're in the loop as well.
I will do that, yes.
Because as we told them when they were here, this is now on them. So they need to be compliant with what we've put forth. And we're not going to continue to accept their flouting of the requirements that we've put in place. So I'm sorry you've had to continue to go through it, but we will continue to keep diligent about making sure that they are complying with what we've put forth.
And hopefully it's soon, so my front yard looks presentable again.
I hear you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Sapp.
Mr. Chairman, just for the record, I asked Mr. Coyce to go out to the site unrelated to tonight's resolution. He did provide me with a report today. I intend to have a conversation with both the administrator and the chief tomorrow on this and other matters, and see what we can do to move the process along.
Yes, I mean, there may well be, depending on his report, certain current ordinances or whatever being violated. I merely mentioned that this resolution allows other measures very much detailed here to take place as well and to be enforceable. So I'm hoping that that will help. And that was the board's hope in doing this, that we can finally put some of these type of specific controls on that operation.
Yeah, the resolution notes a 30-day compliance and a 90-day compliance, so it's not going to happen tomorrow, but it should happen in time. It's very clear about it.
Yeah. Okay, roll call then, Lucille.
Thank you. Mr. Wagner?
Yes.
Mr. Julian?
Yes.
Mr. Murden?
Yes.
Mr. Peason?
Yes.
Committeeman Delcor?
Yes.
Chairman Dr. Teresa?
Yes. Okay. Any business from the floor for items not on the agenda? The Pearson Properties hearing is on the agenda, so if you're here for that, it'll be up in a moment. If not, then for public hearings, I would first announce that the Chrismic Associates hearing, file 14 PB 21 MSR, has been adjourned until further notice with renotice. So at this point, there'll have to be renotice for them to come back. And that leaves one hearing, Pearson Properties LLC, 15 PB 05 MSRV, Block 151.09, Lot 220, at 340 Valley Road. Counselor?
Mr. Chairman, for the purposes of the record, Mr. Lapani and Mr. Julian, both, and Dr. Cerisi, yourself, have all signed the documents indicating that you have done the necessary review of the last meeting, minutes and/or video, and therefore are eligible to vote if there is an action tonight.
Thank you. Counselor?
Great. Thank you, Dr. Chairman Cerisi. We completed our affirmative presentation at the last meeting and were advised that the objector would have several witnesses. I don't see the objector's attorney. I don't see the objector's attorney here.
That's good.
I do reserve the right for rebuttal. I also know that Mr. Dottie prepared a report, which after some discussion back and forth, eventually agreed with the findings of our noise
Could you
analysis.
please speak up a little bit?
Sorry.
Yeah.
Agreed with the findings, our
There you
noise
go.
analysis, that would, it would meet the requirements, and in any event, the applicant has agreed as a condition to affirmatively prove before operating the plant for reasons other than proving noise, to affirmatively prove that it meets all the noise requirements. So, and that was agreed to as a condition. So I'm not exactly sure where we stand without the objector's
And
attorney.
how will that occur?
We'll be providing a noise study to the township in compliance with the administrative code's noise study regulations, showing with actual taking of measurements with the plant up and running for the purposes of taking those measurements, showing that it does comply with the noise limits
This is after it's built.
What's that?
This is after it's built?
after it's
Yeah.
built, yes.
During the operations.
And if it's not compliant, then it can't operate.
Okay.
All
I
right,
think that takes care of the noise issue.
okay, Counselor, thank you. We will call our noise expert up, though, to speak to his evaluation. Mr. Dottie?
Mr. Chairman, before
yeah.
you call Mr. Dottie, I
Oh.
believe that one of the objector's experts is here, Mr. Litwonia.
Uh-huh.
And I would ask if he would come to the front so we can get an idea maybe whether or not we're going to see Mr. Gazarovski this evening.
Oh, you mean whether he would know? I see. Okay.
Because
Did he not hear us? He might be listening to something.
I believe he's coming.
Okay.
And the reason I'm suggesting this is that the objector's testimony would be next, and then
Well,
Mr.
I-
Dottie at the end.
I was just waiting for Mr. Gazarovski.
Oh, you are, sir, so you're expecting him to be here?
Yes, I was.
Mr.
Okay,
Litwonia,
hold that
can
up
you
close
speak
to your mouth.
Yeah.
Yes, I was.
Just
You-
to state your name, please.
Oh, yeah.
I'll give him a phone call. I'll give him a call on my cell.
Could you just state your name, sir?
Alexander Litwarnia. It's Litwarnia.
Thank you.
Okay, so you'll
Give
be
him a
checking
call
into
and
his
tell him
status. Thank you. Okay. All right.
Thank you.
My suggestion is we wait to see what the results of that are before we put Mr. Dottie on.
It's not our-
Well, is that really dependent on whether an objector is here or not? I mean, it still becomes a matter of the written record for any further.
I'm not concerned. The issue is if we put Mr. Dottie on and he's not here for the testimony, or if he's not intending to
But
come,
let me ask you something. He's a lawyer, though.
the last time I looked.
Right. So therefore, however, although he just left the room.
No, not this gentleman.
No.
This gentleman,
No. All right.
the objector is represented by
Is
counsel.
this, the person who is here from the objector, is he not the noise expert?
He is their engineer, among other things.
Okay. Would he not therefore be here to represent the objector for the material being testified to?
Correct. But I would indicate to the board that we retain Mr. Dottie relative to the claims of the applicant and the claims of the objector relative to the noise issues.
Well, I think we retain Mr. Dottie because the board would like to hear a party independent of the applicant and the objector as to what he has to say about the noise issue, regardless of whether the objector's lawyer is here or not, no?
Up to the board.
All right, well, no, I mean, well, ask the board. I just, I don't know why the objector's lawyer should stop us from doing what we're here to do at the time that we're here to do it. That's,
It doesn't, except for the fact that, in reality, it's his presentation next now that the applicant has completed his testimony. The next set of testimony would technically come from the objector and then from our
Right.
expert.
right. You mean, you believe that the objector's testimony should come before our experts?
Yes.
I see.
But we
I'm-
have no control over the objector's testimony.
And frankly, I
And
don't-
we're here as a board.
If the board wishes,
He knows the time that our meeting is.
if the board
and
wishes
when
to
it's-
have Mr. Dottie come and testify, I have no problem with that.
Thank you. Mr. Dottie? Now, you need to swear, right,
Yes.
Mr.?
Raise your right hand. Do you swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. State your full name, spelling your last name,
Norman Dottie, D-O-T-T-I.
and your business address.
1525A Beaver Dam Road, Point Pleasant, New Jersey.
Thank you.
Mr. Dottie, the board employed your services to review what data and reports there were concerning the potentiality of, or probably the certainty of this factory producing noise and to what degree it would produce noise. You did provide the board with a sort of a written summary report, but we would ask you now to testify to that report to the record and provide some detail of your of what you reviewed and how you reviewed it and how you what conclusions you arrived at and how you arrived at them.
Before that, Mr. Chair, I'd ask Mr. Dottie to place on the record his qualifications.
Okay, fine.
For the
Which
record.
We're already on the record with his RFP, or with our RFP and his response to it, but okay, in the written record, but sure, verbally, go right ahead.
Good evening again. I'm Norman Dottie. I'm an acoustical engineer with the Russell Acoustics. Been an acoustical engineer. Is this what I understand? This better? I've been an acoustical engineer for 44 years. I'm a licensed professional engineer and a licensed planner in New Jersey. I have a bachelor's degree in engineering from Stevens Institute of Technology, a master's from NJIT. I have a dozen postgraduate courses in acoustics dealing with materials, instrumentation, signal processing, speech analysis, or related to sound and vibration work. That's what I do. I developed and taught the Advanced Noise Control course for the U.S. Department of Labor's OSHA Training Institute for 10 years. For 10 years, I taught taught courses in industrial noise control for Bruel and Care. That's B-R-U-E-L, and Care is K-J-A-E-R. They're probably the leading instrumentation manufacturer in the field. I've done classified work in acoustics for the Department of Defense. I've taught courses to industry, municipalities, testified as an expert in acoustics in New Jersey, local boards such as this, from Cape May to Mahwah, municipal courts, county court, state court, and federal court.
All right, Mr. Bernstein, you're right, it sounds very impressive.
Not like that, Mr. Chairman, it's necessary for the record.
Well, I would simply say that us having already reviewed his qualifications and hired him represents a decision by the board on the record.
Absolutely, but for purposes of a potential
So,
record.
in any case, though, I'm glad that we spoke of that today. All right, please, if you proceed.
One other thing I'd like
Yes,
to
sir.
add on that.
Certainly.
I'm also an appointed member of the New Jersey State Noise Control Council, which writes the noise regulations and advises NJDEP on noise matters.
Is that all?
So,
Well,
so you could speak.
there's more, but that's enough.
thought so.
Yeah, so you can speak to the intent of the law here, which
Yes.
is an interesting thing. Okay,
So,
okay.
as you know, I was retained to review the applicant's report, and I have a letter June 25th from Lewis S. Goodfriend and Associates. And I started with that, read over what was done, and quite frankly had a lot of questions. I've told them separately that I thought they ought to have more meat in the thing, but I asked the questions. I've worked with them before, so I know what they tend to do. And the bottom line of it all was that they used a commercial computer program called SoundPlan, which I also happen to use, and they got acoustical information, the sound emission characteristics, if you will, of all the different sources that they expect to have in the plant, the burners, pumps, motors, fans, trucks, bucket loaders, etc. And this goes into the model along with location information on all the sources, elevation, terrain, etc. The model follows an ISO standard on noise propagation that's used globally. And they proceeded to turn the crank a few times on the computer model and calculate the projected sound level for different combinations of equipment. And they broke it down into really daytime operations and nighttime operations. Once I worked my way through all this, I had a number of questions about what they had done, and I expressed that in my initial letter to the board, and then had conversations with Good Friend Associates and got some clarifications on what they had done. When I looked into the model, I could see how they went about doing that. It was legitimate, unusual. I told them, I used the phrase unusual but legitimate, how they did it. And so at the end of the day, what they did is reasonable, and their sound level calculations, to a reasonable degree of engineering certainty, are good. They also did ambient noise studies out at the site. In a way, that doesn't really matter. The way the noise regulation works is it doesn't care what the sound out there at a particular site is. You still have to meet the noise criteria. So if it was a quarry operation and they were blasting next door, and that's part of the ambient, and you'd never hear the concrete plant ever, it doesn't matter. The concrete plant still has to meet the limits. And the fact that the ambient is very loud doesn't get them off the hook on that regard. Conversely, if it was very quiet out there, they could come along and raise the sound level up to the limit, and people would notice a significant difference, but it would still be in compliance. Their ambient measurements were a few 10-minute intervals, daytime, nighttime. They showed sound levels that were appreciable. The area of interest is the closest receptor is a residence across the road from the entrance of the plant. The sound levels that they've measured out there are significantly over what the limits are, but the applicant is not responsible for those sounds. So in reality, the operating plant, I would expect that the neighbor isn't even going to hear the thing if they meet the levels that they're supposed to meet. As was represented to you, they need to meet the standards, and if they don't, they either have to fix it or start paying some serious fines, and ultimately they could be shut down. I did recommend, and apparently whether it was because I recommended it or they've done it separately, but I recommend to the board that you do make it a condition of approval that tests be done to show that they indeed comply, and they have to. And the protection on that is that the noise standard is a performance standard, so they have to continue to meet it. And if somebody in the town, an affected person is the term the state uses, but certainly your health official could contact the county, who is mandated by the state DEP to come out and take sound measurements. So if something developed a year from now and it was felt that they might be over, you do have a mechanism. The neighbor has a mechanism. They don't need you to do it. They can call the county and initiate an investigation.
In terms of the data that was fed into the computer program, is that data come from sort of standards, or does it come from actual measurements of similar equipment or facilities somewhere else?
I can't answer that because I don't know where they got each thing from. The numbers for the kinds of sources that are in there seem reasonable. From my experience, it's probably a mix of published data on equipment. Some manufacturers of certain kinds of equipment publish sound data, and other things you have to go out and measure it because it just doesn't exist. The kind of data that you put into Sound Plan, it needs some work to get it right. And so, again, as a user of it, I will take measurements around a source knowing that I'm going to put that data in the Sound Plan. Completely different set of measurements that I would if I was trying to determine compliance. So one's for, is it a legal operation? The other is for engineering purposes. So they would have to really answer that question, and if you had specifics about a particular source, Mr. Chairman.
In terms of when you mentioned that you asked them questions and they made some explanations to you that led you to conclude that it was unusual but legitimate, could you tell us some of those explanations or the answers that you got that were unusual but still legitimate? Because I'm sure they'll come up at some point.
Certainly.
Yeah.
What different pieces of equipment operate at different times on the plant, at the plant. From most macroscopic standpoint, there's daytime and nighttime. There's other combinations as well. What they did was in the model, you can specify for each source, not just its sound emissions, but also the times that it is on and off, or operating at 50% output versus 100% output, those kind of things. A full-blown sound plan model can be quite an extensive piece of development work. So what they did was, instead of having, say, half a dozen different what SoundPlan calls situations or configurations of equipment. Situation 1 might be half a dozen pieces of equipment operating at once. Situation 2 might be 2 of those half dozen sources plus another 8 more, and so on. Instead of breaking it up that way, they did it by artificially putting in that this source is on from this time to this time, and then rest of the time it's off. And then they did that for the different sound sources that would all be operating at the same time. So and times are totally arbitrary. They do them in 1 hour increments. So from a calculation standpoint, from 9 a.m. to 10 a.m., they had those first 6 sources that I talked about as hypothetical turned on. And then from 10 to 11, they had some additional sources turned on, but they also still had 2 of the 6 turned on from the first time. So instead of running these different scenarios separately, they got to run them all at one shot and then look at the results, which come out on an hour-by-hour basis. And the time wasn't really time of day. It was an arbitrary way of looking at combinations of sources.
So what you're saying is that each hour in their model represented a particular combination.
Correct, not what was necessarily happening at that hour.
If a real plant is operating.
Right.
I see. Way to use the program.
I would have done it differently, but I would have been a little more lockstep, but the results would be the same.
Was it clear that from the model perspective, at some point there was a worst-case scenario, sort of a full capacity
Yes.
measurement? Okay,
Yes.
so that we knew at a time when all of the equipment that could possibly be operating at one time was operating?
Well, I don't
and
know
all the
about
other
possibly, but there are different things that operate or don't operate in combination.
Right, so there's some things that if one's running, another one would not be.
For
That's my
example,
point.
yes.
So what is the worst-case scenario?
Yes.
When all the possibilities of things running are running? That was
Yes.
part of the model.
Yes, and that leads to the second part, and I discussed it in my letter, is most of the sources there are stationary. They don't move around the site, but some are. There's some trucks and a bucket loader. And modeling those is doable, but there are some subtleties to it. And I discussed that with them because I did not agree with how they had done that. So they went back and looked at some things, and we discussed a way of doing it, and we did exactly what you were saying there. If you have a source that's moving back and forth between where I'm sitting and where you're sitting, Mr. Chairman, from the perspective of different listeners, it's going to be louder for you when it's close to you and quieter when it's close to me. So what was done was they looked at the tracks, the paths that the vehicles followed, recognizing that the critical location was that home across the street, what's referred to as location 1. They put the equipment up at that end of the site rather than anywhere along its trail and ran the calculations. And so that was a worst-case scenario there.
So, right, so it's certainly much easier, but also quite legitimate to run a worst case rather than every case, because every other case doesn't matter as much as the worst case.
That's correct, and I often worst-case things. Until you run them, though, you don't know what you're going to get. So
Right.
that's why they do it.
Okay. Mike? Oh, Neil.
Oh, yeah.
I'm sorry.
So, my noise compliance knowledge, and I remember going over this or asking the applicant this as well. I know different times of the year, different weather conditions, different seasonal affects noise. So I was concerned in terms of how the township could be assured of compliance based on, when those noise tests would occur, or is that something that the applicant would choose based on their selection of those optimum parameters? So that was something that I thought, well, you need to set up the model so that it's, you look at it fairly, depending on those conditions.
Well, the model actually does have environmental factors in it. What makes it nice in many situations that we have to deal with, and it's true here, is that these things are relatively close. Wind can decrease sound, it really doesn't increase it. You have sounds traveling at 700 plus miles an hour. A strong wind is 10 miles an hour, so it doesn't have much effect on it. In fact, you can't take measurements when the wind is above 12 miles an hour because of sound, because the wind flow over the microphone gives you false readings. So on a really windy day, you can't take valid measurements in any case. Trees, etc., I'm sorry to say, but trees don't stop sound. At least the working number from my experience, and I've measured it, 100 meters of dense woods, that's like 330 feet if you don't do metric, will give you about a 5 decibel reduction. I was out at the site. There's some tall evergreens out there, things like that. Whether those trees are there or not make no difference on the sound. Environmental factors within 1,000 feet are in my opinion, can be ignored.
Some of the experiences I have with that, I mean, I know on a clear day, we might get more issues versus a low ceiling. But I don't think that's a type of noise similar to what I've experienced versus like what they have there. But
what goes into it is often more subtle than people realize. For example, a lot of people will say, well, snow obviously absorbs sound because when it snows, look how quiet it gets. Mm-hmm. But what really happens is motor vehicle traffic slows down, and that's the source of the environmental noise. And so you think it's indirectly snow does, but it's not because the acoustical characteristics of snow, it's what it does to traffic.
Interesting.
Fog is another one.
Yeah, the fallacy of mixing up association with causation.
Exactly.
so in your estimation, I mean, if they test, and whenever they want to test, that's sufficient in terms of your, your review or your opinion?
For where these receivers are, in particular, the most sensitive one being across the street, that's the hardest location to meet. Okay. At that distance, it doesn't matter. If we're talking a mile away, something like that, for sure.
Okay.
Can we go back to the trees for a second?
Oh, wait for this one. This is Mike's beloved trees, but
We've over the years, we've planted, we've had berms with pine trees staggered, and I've taken the measurements when we were going to first do it in 1978, and the noise level dropped off. We did it at the Citizen shooting range outside of Princeton, and because they wanted to put a shooting range in town. And I had the acoustical instruments and everything else, and it dropped off significantly as I backed up past the trees. It wasn't 300 yards. And since then, we've put in staggered pines in baseball fields, in DPW, and all along many of the developments, and it's knocked down noise significantly. And it gets better with time as the trees get denser and get taller. And now, we brought this up to the applicant, the board did, and the applicant has agreed to put the trees up in addition to all the how would you say, modifications to the equipment for noise reduction, so that it's sort of like a belt and suspenders. I don't agree with you to say that they don't have any significance. I've measured it myself, and it's been reduced in many cases.
You said trees and a berm.
Yes.
Berms are great,
Oh, yeah, no doubt about it.
but I'll be glad to supply references. on
So
the-
are you saying
No,
that?
you don't have to. I already did measurement. In other words, we can be intelligent people and agree to disagree.
Absolutely.
But the thing here is that we've seen it, and it's worked well, but it has to get dense. Yeah, the berms are definitely knocking down the sound, but the sound source is usually above the berms. And
Depends on the scenario, but
Yeah.
yes, it's certainly, I said dense woods, if you recall.
yes,
And there absolutely is an out of sight, out of mind factor too. When you put up a barricade, an attractive barricade, let's call it, not stacking shipping containers on top of each other, which worked very well, by the way. It is lovely.
yes.
I'm not advocating that. People feel better about it, and that's good. It takes a lot of trees, and they have to be dense.
We'll agree to disagree a little bit on that.
I ain't touching that.
The tree one, this is not the first time I've heard pushback on that.
So is the berm more effective than the tree? Is the berm adding more of a sound barrier than the tree on
Well,
top of it?
any barrier needs to block line of sight between a source and a receiver. But a berm of X feet high is really just as effective as a acoustical barrier that's X feet high.
And does that extrapolate over distance, the sound wave diminish, that if it's 1,000 feet away and that berm isn't as high, and that changes your eye level?
Well,
Or is-
at great distances, berms or barriers don't change the sound at larger distances very much. They're effective for people who are close up to the barrier, in what's called the shadow zone. But on the other hand, for the people further away, they're not getting as much reduction, maybe nothing effectively from the berm or barrier, but they also have the advantage of greater distance. But it is possible. We run into this in that, and it's a factor in the state, in doing measurements for the state noise regulation. People say, well, the measurement's made at the property line. Well, that's not quite true if you really read the thing carefully. You could imagine a scenario where you have a sound source, and right next to the property line is a barrier or a berm, and you take the measurement on the other side of it, you're getting a full
Zero.
shielding effect of the berm or barrier. And say, oh, this is great, but go back 50 feet and up on the second floor bedroom window of the house, which is now looking down across the top of the barrier, it can actually be louder further away. So in that scenario, the measurements should be made at the second floor bedroom window. Because nighttime's predicated on sleep disturbance, so that's the rationale for it.
The numbers that you reviewed, did they have any barrier built into them or no?
Oh, they have multiple barriers around a bunch of different sources. That's in the sound plan model.
That's in the sound plan
Yes.
model. Does that include a property line barrier like a berm with the model doing the measurement behind the berm?
No,
or-
there's no berm that I
No
recall.
berm in the model. The barriers here are part of the manufacturing facility.
Around the equipment.
Yeah.
A barrier, and I'll
Right.
use, instead of keeping on saying barrier and berm, I'll just say barrier, is most effective for a given height, either very close, as close as possible to the source or as close as possible to the receiver. Well, you're not going to put the berm or barrier up around the house, so you're going to do it right around the equipment. That way, for a given size, you get the most reduction.
Right, so the best barriers by the equipment, and this includes that. So I'm just saying, it doesn't include anything that doesn't matter, like a berm on the property line that the sound would go straight over the top of to the house. You're talking about barriers that are right by the source, where they have maximum effect or close to the source.
Correct.
Okay. Other questions? No? Okay. Bill?
Mr. Chairman, for purposes of the record, let's indicate for the record Mr. Dottie's reports of August 27, 2015. A memorandum received by the township, which was passed along to Mr. Dottie from Jack Zabora of Lewis as Good Friend and Associates, dated September the 1st, 2015, and Mr. Dottie's supplemental report of September 1st, 2015, are all in the record before the board.
Okay. Public hearing's still open, so I guess we would call for anyone, whether that be from the applicant, the objector, or the audience, who would have questions for this witness. Raise your hand. Counselor, you would speak for the applicant, yes?
Just a quick question.
Sure, come to the microphone now.
I would note that we're not going to back out on the promise to put in the trees based on that. So,
Thank you.
no need to worry about that. Just to clarify, Mr. Dottie, you said that to a reasonable degree of certainty in the field of acoustical engineering, you would agree with Mr. Zybora's noise projections, the ultimate numbers that he found in his report?
Yes, with the understanding that I believe the input data is reasonable. I haven't verified that.
Right.
I understand what calculations were done, that sort of thing. And so, and from my experience with using the methodology for quite a long time, I trust it myself. And so I believe that the results will be what they are. And then this, again, the saving, not to beat it to death, but the saving grace is they have to comply, and there's an enforcement mechanism.
And you
Yes.
believe to a reasonable degree of certainty in the field of
Just Mr. Fisher, please.
sorry, the field of acoustical engineering that those noise controls or the compliance can be done with the equipment proposed or any additional that may be necessary.
Yes.
And also one final question is it standard in the acoustical engineering industry to receive data from a manufacturer without actually going to the manufacturer's plant and testing the equipment yourself?
Yes, very common.
Okay.
Counselor, I would ask you, do you have someone here who can testify to the sources of the data that were put in the model?
We did before. It was on cross-examination that it came
Okay.
up, but I can have Mr. Zybora testify again to that.
Okay, thank you, just to remind us.
I would add to that one always has to look at data of any sort, in my opinion, from the basis of knowing what your field of expertise. Certainly over the years, I've seen data that I look at and I say, there's just no way that's not happening. And anybody probably does that in their profession who's knowledgeable. I didn't have that feeling here, but with that caveat, yes.
Okay.
I'm done.
Oh, yeah, okay, and then when you're,
Then I'll bring Mr. Zybora.
okay. Any other questions for the board's expert? From anyone? Okay.
May just want to see Mr. Livornia if
Oh,
he
yes.
spoke to Mr.
Do you
Gazarovski.
want to ask any questions right here, right now? You're welcome to.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I would just like to ask Mr. Dottie, I personally agree with what he has stated. I just want to know if he's recommending that the applicant provide more details of exactly what the remediations and barriers are supposed to be, and have them indicated on the plan so everyone will know what they're supposed to be built or not.
To me, what's in sound plan says it. There's data in there. Characteristics of the source, dimensions on barriers, attenuation of barriers, all that sort of thing. So that stuff is in the sound plan model. I personally don't need it. Now, I don't know what your practice is, whether you want them to show barriers around pieces of equipment or something like that, I don't know. I don't like over-specifying and to get into a specific product lots of times, because with say a barrier, there's a whole bunch of ways it can be done, and whether it's this material, that material, as long as it meets certain criteria, you can build it out of peanut butter for all I care, as long as it works.
That would seem very absorptive, actually.
Well, my only point was if the board doesn't know what's supposed to be built, it'd be difficult to determine what's supposed to be built if there aren't any plans or specifications from the sound expert.
Mr. White?
The proof will be in the pudding with the sound test afterward. I mean, if this applicant's willing to put this much money into this plant and not make sure all these barriers are in there, and then they exceed the sound levels, they're between a rock and a hard place.
Well,
So that's one step we have to protect.
I understand that because I've seen factories closed down in the Canada, and we represent various municipalities, and we've lost industry because of the fact that the sound requirements and sound legislation was followed, and therefore the factories had to close down and move out of town. So it's not something that doesn't happen. So that's one of the reasons I'm just concerned that if there's the applicant doesn't show some of the things that are going to be on there, we might be going in circles.
Well, I can understand that, but what you just said is what counts is what's the sound level over there. If right now there's a particular piece of equipment that has a barrier around it to get the net sound out of it less, why should I have to put in that barrier if I can find another piece of equipment that does the job from an asphalt plant standpoint, but is much quieter? All of a sudden, I'm saying, well, gee, you didn't put in this barrier that you said you were going to. I say, and it's on the drawing that was approved, yet I say, but I put in a quieter piece of equipment. I don't need that anymore. The overriding saving factor on all of this is it's not just a paper evaluation. At the end of the day, it has to meet. They've said they can hit 49 dBA, the limit being 50 out there. Do they do that? That's what counts.
I think that what you're asking is a better question to ask of the applicant rather than our expert who is working with standard practices in the industry for doing an evaluation of data. I think it's better to ask the applicant's expert what they, intend or what their standard practice is, presuming that they have other plants, which I believe they do, for noise barriers of this type.
Let me just ask one final question.
Sure.
And the final question is, as Mr. Dottie knows, we usually request when he does a noise study that it be done like 30 or 60 days after, and then a follow-up 6 months later, so that we can get the full operation going and it could be tested in day and night conditions. And if that's acceptable, I would recommend that the board do that, as we recommended that to Mr. Dottie before on the studies, because we feel that it's a safekeeping to the municipality to do something like that.
Mr. Dottie?
I'm not sure if that was a question or
Well, the
whatever.
question is-
Do you think that's a reasonable practice to, to not only do the sort of the acceptance test, how I think of it, but then a 6-month check after the thing's in full
It-
operation?
It's not unreasonable. I'm not a fan of every year, let's go out and do a test either. And Mr. Lawarney is correct that in his capacity of acting like me advising a board, he has made those recommendations to boards, specifically on a project where I'm in his position, or I should say the applicant's position on another site, and the applicant agreed to do that.
I could tell you in my industry, and it's not the same thing at all, the pharmaceutical industry, pharmaceutical medical device industry, we obviously, we have to do validation of things. But once we do them, we don't keep redoing them, unless we change something, right? If we change something, then you have to revalidate. But if you have a system and you haven't changed it, you don't keep revalidating, retesting, revalidating the system.
I'm not advocating we revalidate it annually. We've run into that type of situation, and it just seems like it's a waste of time after a couple of tests or 2 years. It's never going to change after a year or two, so why keep going?
Okay.
But the only reason we were concerned is because in the applicant's noise study, it did mention the fact that they thought there was almost minimal or no night time operations. And as everyone knows, all the county roads and state roads, well, the municipality here doesn't allow nighttime operations on paving. The state and county do on any high-volume roads, and they need asphalt to do that. That's
Okay.
one of the reasons we have.
So you mean, okay, gotcha. I hear what you're saying.
There
Thank
is.
you, Mr. Chairman.
There
Okay.
is another situation. I believe it was testified that the recycling material wouldn't be there initially, and that would be a change of operations if the recycling material was being mixed
Well,
in
then-
as time went on. But I would like, when you have your person on, sitting on the dais, to answer that. Yeah.
Okay, why don't we do that?
Thank you.
That's the only thing I can think of.
Any other questions for Mr. Dotty? Seeing none, Mr. Dotty, thank you. If you could hang with us here, because we
Absolutely.
may have you you may want to ask some questions of what you hear.
Thank you for your time.
Mr. Chairman, just for the record, I'd just like to point out, Mr. Gazarovski is not going to be able to come. He got caught in the flooding on the way up, so he's probably swimming a little right now.
Okay.
Thank you.
We wish him well then. Counselor?
All right, I'd like to bring up Jack Zybura with, who's a good friend and associates. He's an acoustical engineer who's previously testified before this board in this application. And he's also, I believe he remains sworn from his previous testimony. This board has heard and accepted his qualifications. So I'd like, Mr. Zybura, if you could address, I guess the first question is, could you explain the sources where,
I just wanted to state his name.
oh, yeah.
George, it's Jack Zybura, Z-Y-B-U-R-A.
Thank you. Sorry.
And Mr. Zybura, could you, I know you've already provided some testimony to this, but could you explain where you got your data from that you put into your model, your study?
Yes, all of the source data was from Aztec, the manufacturer. And from our conversations with them, they gathered that data from measurements on operational plants and operational pieces of equipment. But all the data we received was from the manufacturer.
And
Now, in terms of the question about the barriers that go into the model, how was that arrived at?
So once we when we first run the model, we run it with no barriers, just to see how loud we are and what sources we need to work on to bring down to be below the code. And basically, we just methodically go through and we put in barriers, we adjust the height of the barriers until we get to a level that's below the code. Each source is going to be different once it's installed. It might be one material for one source, another material for another source. You might be able to use acoustical lagging or jacketing instead of a barrier. Some sources can take silencers to help reduce the noise. But all of these different aspects are kind of put in for the type of source that we're handling. And it's really going to take the plant to be built before we can know exactly where that barrier can be placed.
So what you then would have is, based on your modeling, you would have some sort of a game plan for how you're going to install barriers, and then you build it and you see where you're at and determine whether you need more or less or different. Is that not less, but more or different barriers?
Yeah, once it's built, we can kind of see where to put the barriers. I mean, we don't do any of the install. We're independent consultants, but we can recommend where to put the barriers, what height, what material, and then kind of, it's almost like, hitting the lowest fruit on the tree until we get to where we need to be. So we do have a game plan of what sources need to be addressed.
Is that game plan going to be submitted in this application, or
Is
at
that
some point?
standard practice for you to submit that, or to submit your proposed set of barriers?
Not for asphalt plants like this. Most of we don't issue drawings with the noise control recommendations on it. All of our recommendations are in written format letters, and then we work with the plant manufacturer and also the certain noise control manufacturers to see what products will fit where. But usually it's a day two type thing for plants like this.
Okay.
And could you explain what or how a noise study is done to show that the plant complies?
Once we're operational, we'll take some measurements at the receiving properties, at the property line, also within the property in case there are any effects due to shadowing of berms or barriers. But the site itself is pretty flat, so we don't expect that to be an issue. My guess is that when we get out there day one, we're most likely going to meet the daytime code, which is a lot less stringent than nighttime. And then from there, we can work on getting the levels down to the nighttime ordinance.
And that would be done also before actual operations commence?
For the nighttime, yes. I mean, in theory, I guess they could comply with daytime and then be permitted to run during daytime hours only.
Okay. Now, we've heard that there's expected to be a change in operations after some time with recycling starting.
We could certainly come back if requested to take more measurements, but our model does include that additional equipment. It's a full-blown plant build-out in the
Okay,
model.
your model does, but
Yes.
your original acceptance testing won't.
Depending on when we do it, correct.
Right.
I would just object to the idea that using recycled asphalt is any different than using aggregated oil to make asphalt.
No,
I'm sorry. You're the attorney. You can't testify to things like that. I understand it's a whole separate operation on the side. Come on.
Well,
You
I'd
can't
like
do
to-
that
I'd
as
like
an
to
attorney.
Bring on my
Thank you.
witness then.
Okay,
So-
yeah, right, please, yeah. So unless that's a new course in law school or something. So your model, you say you've modeled recycling operations. Now, it really depends, I think, in whether recycling operations and other operations are going on simultaneously, right? Because then it's not so much that you're modeling one or the other, but you have two things going on at the same time. Is that?
The results that we presented were for worst case, everything's on. We didn't even look at what stuff can operate with other stuff. We just put everything on in the model.
Oh, you did do that?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, we also modeled it other ways so we can pick it apart and, see where the contributors were. But in the end result in our report, that's full-blown, everything's running, with everything.
Okay. Mike, any other?
No, the model is great, but reality is a different story. And if you don't have all the operation going, and there's a delay till they get the recycling, it'd be good to get that second test when the recycling is in.
Or more.
Yeah. Well, I'm also a believer you don't have to test every time, but full operations.
I am
Trust but
too.
verify?
No, but
Topic now?
well, no, I think that verifying is great. What you don't necessarily need to do is re-verify without any further changes.
I don't
That
disagree with that,
becomes,
yeah.
an unnecessary burden, unreasonable. But yes, certainly when a change in the operation happens, absolutely.
And just so I'm clear, what is the standard for the testing? Is that done by the applicant with the applicant's engineer, or is that administered by a third party? What is the
It's done to
normal
the,
course?
oh, sorry, it's done to the.
I'd like, sorry.
I mean, when
Counselor,
we're
I'll
doing the first compliance testing, we're also doing it to see where we might also need to add noise control. So I would think we would do the first round of testing just to kind of get our bearings and see, where else we need to perform work. But I mean, the test could be performed by any qualified noise expert, whether it's us, another consultant, or someone from the county.
So what's the plan in this case before operations start? Because I think we'd like something in the resolution about that.
Basically, do you have any thoughts as to when you want to recommend testing, or does Mr. Dottie have any thoughts?
Maybe Mr. Dottie could lend his guidance on this?
I would just recommend you don't do it 6 months after starting an operation, because if they start in June, you're talking about December, and they're not gonna be in operation December, guys.
Yeah.
So that
Yeah.
6-month window is kind of a
I-
long
I-
window.
I would rather not have it as an arbitrary date, but rather as a functional thing as to
Yes,
when the
when-
recycling starts, or before the recycling is gonna start to test the new set of conditions. That's what I would mean, and not an arbitrary number. Mr. Dottie?
An asphalt plant's a pretty complicated thing, and they are seasonal, and you get a high demand, they're gonna wanna run nights and all those kind of things. To do it before they begin operations, unless they get everything working and all that, and then stop and do the testing and then begin operating, it's sort of hard to get everything tested pre-operation. I've seen it done, 30 days afterwards, and the CO is subject to the CO. If you want to do a follow-up some point in time later, clearly the seasonal effect has to be taken into account. There's no point saying 6 months later and it's February. You're absolutely correct. So you need to pick the time accordingly, but they need to have some chance to let things settle down and get going. Sometimes people won't do some tests right up front. They'll wait several months after they begin operation and do the test then, if it's a single test. So it's just do keep those things into account, and I think you are doing just that.
And the standard as to who conducts or who validates?
I've seen it
the-
done
Okay.
both ways. I mean, I've certainly done, when I'm representing an applicant, there've been times when I've done the testing. The assumption being that I'm not lying about it. And I've also seen situations where the applicant doesn't do the testing, but they may do for their own purposes, but the final approval test could be done by somebody else. It's up to you how you want to do that. Gets done both ways.
I have a quick
There's no
question.
implication there. I just want to make sure we're
No,
dealing
when-
with the way
when I'm-
the standard
when-
courses.
Yeah, it can go either way.
I have a
It
quick
always,
question
it
for
has
you.
to make sense, too, at the end. When you look at the results, they have to make sense.
In Mr. Zabor's report, using the modeling and the nighttime residential limits on the north property line, the ambient noise appeared to be higher than the allowable noise. From a practical standpoint, when you do actual testing, how can you differentiate between the ambient noise that might be higher and the actual asphalt plant?
If you were over by the house, let's say, let me reference the numbers there.
Right, I was looking at this report that just had the ambient, there's no page number, page 11.
At the north residential, location number 1, they measured an ambient, now we get into some technical things here. They measured what they call the LEQ, that is the average sound level of 57. So you're trying to pick out a number that's not more than 50 in the presence of a sound that averages 57.
Okay.
And that's very difficult to do.
That's
Except
my
that
question.
if it was a steady 57,
Okay.
then you have a problem doing the measurement there. I would be willing to guess that, especially given the area, that the ambient is fluctuating. So you could look at when it is, if the plant is at a steady state condition, and that's an if, then what's the quietest, the first approximation would be, what's the quietest it ever gets in between the cars and trucks and airplanes and birds chirping and everything else. Second thing you can do is you go towards the source, so you actually get higher sound levels, take your measurement there and then extrapolate them back out to, so it's an indirect
Well,
kind of thing
I would
there.
tend to say we would leave that to the experts, and the question is who are the expert that would be doing the compliance testing?
Yeah, but you
That's-
hit a good, I have a particular sore point with how compliance people do ambient testing. If you go to another neighborhood and say, well, that's the same, and take it there, that often doesn't turn out to be the case. So you have to do it very carefully in the situation where you've got an ambient that's comparable to that thing which you are trying to measure.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, why don't we have 2 sets of testing done? I don't know how you guys can decide how you want to do it, third party or the applicant's professionals. About this plant startup, there's going to be problems. They always work out the bugs. Not all the equipment's going to be operating at the same time as if they're in full-blown operation. And, you know, they're selling, they're paving 287 or wherever else, and they need a lot of material. I think, why don't we look at testing within 30 days of TCO, when they start up. And then again, within 30 days after they change operation, which I guess is going to add in the recycling part of it. Give them a chance to ramp it up so that it's really worst-case scenario. Because if you, in the very beginning, you're not going to hear much, probably, because not everything's going to be operating. Even the operators themselves, you know, it's a new plant for them. It's going to take them a while to get used to everything working.
Well, that makes sense, I think, to everyone here. Then the second question is, who does it?
That's up to you guys. I mean, these guys are professional engineers. They're signing and sealing this. It's their license on the line if it's incorrect. Right, Mr. Merringer?
Absolutely.
So I would ask the applicant, is the applicant willing to agree to that and to do the testing with its experts?
Yeah, just waiting for him to come up.
With our expert, right?
Yes, yes. With who has their license on the line,
Yes.
right.
Yes, that would be,
Yeah.
Okay, so if you agree to what Mr. White just said, and to do it with your expert and their signature and their legal affirmation that it's legitimate, then, okay.
For the record, we have the applicant that just spoke, his name, just for the record.
oh, that was Kurt Mitchell of the applicant.
Thank you.
Very good. Any other questions for the applicant's expert? Any questions from Mr. Dottie first? Any further questions from you for the applicant's expert? I know you've talked to him extensively.
No.
Okay, thank you. The objector's expert, any questions? Now's your chance to talk directly to the applicant. Sure, of course. Why don't you take the handheld there? And then bring
Thank
that
you.
over to yourself. Great.
One of the things that I was interested in is in page 7 of your report, it says that the recommendations in the report are acoustical in nature and should be reviewed by a design professional. What does that mean?
Well, that needs to be reviewed for structural compliance, wind load, stuff like that. And that's not just, we're not structural engineers, we're not civil engineers. So we want to make sure that anything that's put in is safe and code compliant. And another
Okay.
professional will have to review those installations.
So you would be providing the data for the noise attenuation, and then somebody else would be verifying the structural capabilities of it?
Yeah, we'd be providing the required noise reduction and also the, some sample
Okay.
products
Just-
that could meet those.
Just was wondering what that meant. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. The other question that I had was on the model. And some of the data that you provided in the model was from the manufacturer, which it had various noise standards and noise emissions from the various pieces of equipment, but it didn't specify at what distance the noise levels were measured at.
All the data from the manufacturer was provided in terms of sound power, which is independent of distance.
Okay, thank you. I wasn't clear of what you had there. The other question I had is on the type of facility that this is, where there's a lot of loading and unloading. There, to me, would be a lot of impulse sound. Is that modeled in the model, taken into account?
Only as far as it was in the manufacturer's source data. They didn't specify whether it was an impulsive source or whether it was a continuous source. It was just the levels of that particular piece of equipment.
Well, the equipment I was concerned about was the trucks loading and unloading, which isn't really manufacturing equipment.
The truck data we use from our own database, which we took of basically truck pass-bys and also truck operations, and it would be the maximum sound level occurring during whatever truck event we were measuring. So if it was
So when
loading, it would be the dumping or the revving up of an engine.
So if the load of macadam falls into a truck, you've gotten the measurements for that?
Correct.
Okay, I was just wondering if that was covered, because I didn't see that anywhere. And the only other question I had was one more question, and that was on the truck loading facilities and the truck noise. Since there is well, how did you determine how many trucks would be in the site, circulating or not?
We basically modeled the entire path that the truck would take as a radiating line source.
And how many trucks did you take into account?
We took the level from one truck, but then applied it across that whole path, so the whole path is radiating at the same time.
Well, would that vary if you had not one truck, but 10 trucks circulating at the same time?
There would still be 10 trucks distributed amongst the line, which is kind of the way we modeled. We distributed the source across that path.
So if there were 20 trucks, would that change anything?
I don't think it would change it based on what we modeled.
So how many trucks did you actually utilize in the mountain?
We took the data for one truck, but we distributed it to be along the entire line of the path.
But if there are 40 trucks, 20 coming in and 20 coming out in an hour, wouldn't that modify that noise?
You still can only have one truck. The entire line is radiating as a truck, essentially. So it's almost as if that entire line was made of trucks.
You have some trucks coming in and some going out, so at the same time.
Correct, but they're not going to collide. They
I
will
hope
be
not.
spaced out.
Okay, well, I'm not sure exactly how that came into effect in the model. I just thought that was a question I had. Okay, that's the only questions I had. Thank you.
Okay. Any other questions for this witness? Okay, seeing none, Counselor. Anybody else you had?
I just have 1 second.
Mm-hmm.
Excuse me, I did have one other question.
Oh.
And that wasn't really the applicant, it's really what the board engineer had previously mentioned, that they wanted to have a report signed and sealed by the applicant. And it wasn't mentioned, signed and sealed and signed by a professional engineer, and I just questioned whether that's what you had to be included in the resolution that is approved.
Absolutely.
Yeah,
Thank you. I just wanted to clarify.
standard practice.
Mr. Chairman, if I recall at the last hearing, the applicant also offered to eliminate the reuse of the existing residence.
Yes.
I don't know if we have, he offered it, but I don't know if that's what they're still offering at this point, or if the board's
Well,
even
ask
considering it.
ask counsel. Yeah.
We were talking about the front residence.
Correct.
We have offered in the alternative a variance-free application, which we would destroy, I guess, the front residence instead of making an adaptive reuse of it as a support office, and also destroy the rear building that is 18 feet too close to the setback instead of making reuse of it as a building for the operation there. I think we had testimony that we don't think that's a good, we think it's a waste to do that, but we have offered it.
Okay. Anything else?
No, sir.
Okay. David, anything else?
Yeah, Chairman, just some kind of general housekeeping. I read through the minutes of the last couple of hearings, and just so we're on the same page, it appears that the applicant agreed to meet all the recommendations of both Mr. White's memo of May 28th and Marcia Schiffman's memo of June 4th. Could you confirm that, please?
That is correct.
Thank you. And there was one, the board's benefit, there was two variances had to do with the existing house and the garage, but there was also a waiver for the pole height. Did you agree, and I believe in the minutes you did, to lower the pole heights, but you would still need a waiver, they'd still be higher than required?
We agreed
than permitted?
to work to the engineer's satisfaction as to what eventually they would be. I think the testimony was that it was unrealistic to have the lighting from the ordinance and not need any type of waiver, but that it would have to be to the engineer's satisfaction.
Okay. Thank you.
Any other final questions from the, okay. Any other questions now of any kind for the applicant and the various applicant experts who may be present? Okay, seeing none. I guess, yes, Mike?
Yeah, there's just one thing what Bill brought up about the buildings.
Oh, right,
And
I
we
guess
have to-
that's our, I guess
Yeah,
that's
it's
the
our
consensus
decision,
from
yeah.
us. I mean, huh? What's that, Eric?
He changed his mind.
Okay.
That's a first.
So,
Almost like an engineer.
no? Okay. So, again, destroying the buildings technically clears a variance. On the other hand, it's a pre-existing thing. They don't do anybody any harm. Do we have a preference there?
You were going to use the front house as an office?
Right, to support the operations.
Yeah, that made a lot of sense to me. So to destroy it, you're really removing something that could be valuable to you for an office rather than a residential. And that would be in compliance then.
And we're willing to offer it to the board, just because we understand you may prefer a variance-free application, but if you are
A
willing
little
to,
bit closer.
if you're willing to grant that, we would reuse it in a support manner.
To me, it makes no sense to make them rip the buildings down.
Yeah,
I agree.
and you need offices.
Yes, I mean, a variance that makes no difference, it's
Yeah.
fine. So absolutely keep the buildings as far as the board's unofficial, your opinion is. Unofficial right now until we vote. Okay. So I guess we're at motion to close public.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Pleasure of the board.
I'll make a motion to approve this application with all the applicable items, including the trees that don't.
Trees are it.
And the agreed to testing program
Yes.
after operations, the 2 tests after operations, and all the stipulations and agreements made by the applicant as done through all the hearings. Yes? Anything else you want to add to amend that? Okay.
Mr. Chairman, I'll second that.
Very good. Roll call, please.
I'm assuming I call everyone.
Everyone is eligible.
Okay. Thank you. Mr. Wagner.
Yes.
Mr. Julian.
Yes.
Mr. Merdinger.
Yes.
Mr. Peason.
Yes.
Mr. Lapani.
Yes.
Committeeman Delpour.
Yes.
Chairman Dr. Cerisi.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. We have one bit of planning board business to discuss, which is about upcoming meetings. First of all, David, do we have any business for September 24 business meeting?
No, we do not.
Okay, so motion to cancel September 24 business meeting?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? Okay, canceled. Second item of business, Mr. Bernstein?
Mr. Chairman, it has come to our attention in various discussions between my office and various other township individuals that we will probably need a second meeting in November. The board is currently scheduled for a meeting on November the 12th, and we will probably need an additional meeting either, not both, either November the 5th, which would be a normal, I put that in quotes, night, or November the 19th, which is the third Thursday. I will point out to the board that that is the end of league week for the few who may go, but we will probably need 2 meetings in November.
Does anybody have any objection offhand to November 5, keeping away from league week? And
That's,
is that-
school is off that way. I may be out of town that week.
Oh, jeez.
That's the NJA convention.
That's the teacher convention when the kids are off of school.
I won't be here that week.
November 19th.
The Thursday of League of Municipalities Week, is it pretty much done by then?
Yeah, the league is pretty much over by
Okay.
midday.
Then to stay away from the kids' vacation, then maybe November 19th. I wasn't thinking of that, but yeah, that's a
Then
good
we're going to
point.
need a motion to set a second meeting.
Okay, motion to set a public meeting of the planning board for November the 19th
At 7:30 PM.
at 7:30 PM.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any opposed?
Thank you,
Meeting
Mr.
set.
Chairman.
Okay, that's it for tonight. Our next meeting is, yes, oh, I'm sorry?
We need an acting secretary to sign some books.
Oh, right, we have to appoint an acting secretary.
How could we forget?
Who is it this week?
I'd like
Last
to-
week it was Bobby, yes?
I'd like to nominate myself.
Oh, what a good guy.
Oh, sacrifice.
Motion to close nominations and elect Robert.
Moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
You are appointed.
All right.
One last motion to adjourn this meeting and get Bob signing.
So moved.
Second.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
We are adjourned. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
All right.
I